Wednesday, the 12th, what we're going to do, we're going to call a moratorium on our class so we can just discuss the paper expectations for as long as that takes. I have a sneaking suspicion that some of you have already started, but that's okay. But we're going to go over what the guidelines would be for the paper.
So are we not having a paper for immigration part?
Big pardon?
Are we not having a paper for the immigration section?
No, I don't think so, because it's running too close. And we'll probably have at least today and one other after Wednesday. And then that'll be it as far as our class discussion is concerned in terms of a material. It'll just be discussion. When is the last day of class?
May 5th or 3rd? May 3rd.
May 3rd?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we've got like 2 or 3 more weeks.
Okay, so that would leave us with, this is the 10. It leave us about, after this week, maybe about 2.5 weeks, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Trying to wait a few minutes.
Oh, geez. Here's one.
Good morning.
It's supposed to be so nice out today. It's supposed to be really nice out today.
Today? What's going on?
It's supposed to be nice out, like 77.
Really?
It's like 60, yeah.
What are the times? All day?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's already like almost 70 out.
So
Didn't feel
weird.
like it.
I don't even have spring clothes yet.
Maybe what's the expected high?
I think 77 is the high.
That's pretty high for April.
Yeah.
Friday was cold, was wet,
Nasty.
snowy. It was a very miserable day.
Yeah, it's 61 right now, or 64 now.
It is outside,
Yeah.
and it's supposed to get up around 78, you said?
Yeah.
Ooh, that's high, that's almost 80. I almost had to go into a bare knuckle slugfest with my 9-year-old this morning because he said it's going to be 80 outside. I'm not going to wear a jacket. It's going to be 80. No, you're going to wear a jacket. It's going to be 80 outside. No, you don't wear a jacket. Get out of here. I don't know where he got the 80 from. I think he gets create numbers, it's time or something. If it gets real hot before we stop, I doubt it, but if it does, we'll have maybe our last class outside. We'll find a nice grassy knoll someplace where there isn't too much movement back and forth. I always like to take a class outside at least once. It's nice.
Mm-hmm.
I always start out with 20. When the class ends, I got 10. So where do the rest of them go? Ms. Ruiz, if I could see you after class just for a second. Thank you. Well, we have half of our class. Why don't we get started? Now, do I need to go back to talk about the major destinations of persons coming in from the south to the north? You got those down pretty well? All right. Any other questions from our last discussion?
Can you go over the major destinations again?
Certainly will. The major destinations of people from the Great Migration, poor black people moving from the south to the north, at least 3.5 million between 1914 and 1920. New York City, and this would include Brooklyn, Buffalo, Newark, Camden, Trenton, and Jersey City, New Jersey. Those 1, 2, 3, 4 cities in New Jersey. Then Philadelphia, Harrisburg, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Philadelphia, Harrisburg, and Pittsburgh. Cincinnati, Dayton, Columbus. That's where my southern ancestry came to, both my maternal side and my, well, actually, my paternal side went to Cincinnati, and my father determined Columbus's, because of his going to Ohio State, would be permanent home. But it was Cincinnati, Dayton, Columbus, Toledo, and Akron, Youngstown, and Cleveland. Ohio was very attractive. You had Cincinnati, Dayton, Columbus, Toledo, Akron, Youngstown, and Cleveland. Gary, Fort Wayne, and Indianapolis in Indiana. The family of Michael Jackson, the pop singer, dancer, they settled, his ancestry settled in Gary. I have a woman in the church that I attend who's from Gary. She went to school with 2 or 3 of the Jackson family. Isn't that something? Now, also, black people came to St. Louis and East St. Louis, and East St. Louis, and Kansas City, Missouri. Those 3 cities, St. Louis, East St. Louis, and Kansas City. It's odd, but more people went to Kansas City than St. Louis, although St. Louis is, I think, a larger city. It may not have been at that time because Kansas City was a major stock where they exchanged cattle and whatnot, had a lot of slaughterhouses in Kansas City. And specifically, there were 2 other Midwestern cities, Chicago, of course, and Detroit. Now, those are the major numbers. Now, the smaller numbers, but although quite a few, came to Baltimore and Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Washington, D.C., even though Baltimore and D.C. were considered southern cities at that time. They still are, but they were still points of destination for many, many families on the Underground Railroad. Boston, Hartford, Connecticut, Providence, Rhode Island, and then you had some smaller venues, that would be Chester, Pennsylvania, and Flint, Michigan. Those would be the major cities, large and mid-sized and small, that would claim the attention of black people migrating. There was no migration toward the West Coast at this time. During World War II, that would change with the major increase in shipping, shipbuilding and military posts and bases in California, Washington, and Oregon. But at this point, there was no calculated nor actual migration into the West Coast. Now, when a person or persons move to any place, like when you all came from your various hometowns to the University of Rochester, there was some adjustments to be made. That was especially true for this long trip from the south to the north. Would simply mean that there would be a lot of people in this number, if not the majority, a lot of people in this number who would find it very, very difficult to adjust to a northern community environment. Now, for many who thought that the North was a promised land, there was a great deal of disappointment because life could become a drag to them. And in many ways, their experience in the North would be as drastic as the one that they had in the South, which prompted their leaving the South in the first place. Now, it was an onrush of people. Now, 3.5 million at least over a 6-year period. That is a lot of people. And if we take into account that there were very few social agencies in the North prepared to deal with the number, that city politics were really unprepared to deal with the number, both black and white religious groups were unable to deal with the number in terms of need, yet all of this combination of institutions and agencies provided heroic, I call it heroic assistance. They didn't resolve anything, but they did provide the kind of assistance along with there was a new organization that we are all familiar with, I think, the Urban League. The Urban Leagues were formed in 1911. And they were all established in the North at that time. Good morning. And would see large numbers of blacks vying for their various services. So in that mix, we would have urban leagues, but urban leagues were not in all cities. It was much too early for them to spread. But they were in New York and they were in Chicago. And that was where the brunt of all of the millions of people were going to. Now, many of these persons would be rejected, of course. And much of this rejection was a direct result of white northern racism and also indifference. Now, where protests were not lodged against the migrants, they were nonetheless treated with invisible neglect and apathy. We're reminded what one politician said to President Reagan with respect to how to deal with black people in the 1980s, and his response was with benign neglect. That became kind of a mantra of the Reagan administration, benign neglect. But this is what was happening here. Now, all of this was compounded also by their being rejected in some instances by northern black people. Not all black people in the North welcomed black people coming in from the South. And these would be basically upward mobile black property owners and some of the black educated class who simply attempted to hide themselves from their southern kinsmen because the behavior of those who came from the South, their personalities, their language usage, cultural distinctions, including diet, caused a minority, black Northerners shame, embarrassment, and racial humiliation. Now, it is known that some black churches also were guilty, y'all hear me now, of retreating in the face of the poor Southern black refugees. Though churches of this kind were few, but they did exist. Some churches base membership on the color of one's skin. So dark-skinned black people would have a much more difficult time aligning themselves with a small minority of black religious institutions because their skin was dark. But more than anything else, it was
MI team, call 83600. MI team, call 83600.
But more than anything, it was the hostility of racism that was to prove the most severe, as it led directly to the negative reaction on the part of many northern white people. And we would throw in this group especially city officials who argued that they just could not adjust to the numbers of black people surging into their cities. And they were correct on this point simply because housing would prove to be perhaps the major issue here. Where are they going to live? Where are they going to stay? The officials argued that they just could not develop preparations that could deal with a new and large, mostly poor, black city populations. So it was at this point that ghettos and poor black communities were formed in mostly areas that were rather deplete with respect to services. Now this would be felt immediately in unemployment, as well as in inferior and sometimes very frightful housing. Masses, huge numbers of black men found it nearly impossible prior to wartime mobilization and industrialization. After 1916, that's when the jobs really started opening up because this country went into war production, World War I. But prior to that time, at the beginning of the first year of the Great Migration history, unemployment was out of control. Black men could not find work. Whole black families were shoved into the poorest communities, already containing abjectly poor white people. So integration, racial integration, was a thing that was quickly taken advantage of as poor black people joined poor white people. And many of the poor white people were themselves immigrants from Europe, from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe. Especially Italians and to a lesser extent, Jewish persons. Several families would be crammed into single dwellings where the lack of privacy led inevitably to social diseases and an increase in family disintegration. Now, all this made a prophet of the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, who way back in 1906 saw this coming in a sense, and he wrote a tragic poem called The Sport of the Gods that forecasts the destruction of black families and the shift from south to north, primarily because it would damage their religious stability. Now, though children from these families had the rare opportunity for public schooling by virtue of never having had schooling while in the South, because it was demanded of the children that they pick cotton and tobacco leaves during the same time that the season was high. And the season was always high during the school months, with the exception of November till March. From November to March, those were the only months that black children could be found in schools that were just horrid. But because of this, and due to serious language and grammatical difficulties, many of these children who did go to school found themselves many grades behind their age levels. Many grades. Now, even though you had some academic failures, this needs to be said, and it must be stated, that many white teachers in the schools where these children came were committed to those children and showed little or no biases in attempting to forge these children into quality educative experiences, many of them. That as a further consequence of these undesirable living conditions fostered by unemployment, the lack of social opportunities, the rise of criminal activity, particularly stealing, all of this became common occurrences in the cities. With the increase of more serious crimes and acts of violence, police power became evident in these poor communities, and black men began, for the first time in the social history of this country, black men began to make up a sizable segment of northern prison populations. Now, there is a major book that's been written on this by a woman named Charcy McIntyre. Stony Brook. Everybody know where Stony Brook is? Anybody here from Long Island, around that area? Well, Stony Brook is a school. She did, and this is her PhD dissertation that was good enough to be put into a book. It's called Criminalizing a Race. And it's a very, very strong work. There's a subtitle to it. I have the book. It's a subtitle. Subtitle is the free black experience in America, something like that. Now, as the number of African Americans increased in the North, so did white resistance to them. Now, we can see this if Italians were earmarked for violence, if Irish were earmarked for violence, if the Jewish population coming in from segments in Europe were earmarked for violence, we can understand fully that black people would be earmarked for violence in those same areas, environmentally. Oh, I just noticed something. Y'all sitting in different seats, and there's been no fighting, no arguing. Wonderful, wonderful. Now, attendant to this, pardon me, were escalating incidents of violent racial confrontations on jobs, in the streets, and in the massive movements on the part of whites abandoning their neighborhoods to escape the black presence. Contemporary history calls it the white flight. Now, as terrible as unemployment, inferior housing, and crime was to black people, there were yet other problems that took its fair toll. But none more devastating than the poor health and mental health issues, that prevailed, especially as a consequence of severe winters, which many of them coming from the Deep South never experienced. What has happened over the last 20 years, let's say 20 to 25 years, has been a somewhat of a shift in weather patterns, so that nowadays, beginning in the 80s, severe winter conditions now affect the South, particularly North Carolina with ice storms and things like this. There was a time when the South was relatively free of that in the winter time. The problem in the South was the summertime with the heat and with potential famine in some areas. Thus we had the high numbers of poor white farmers leaving Oklahoma and Texas and going to California. Not because of anything but the fact that famine came and just pretty much destroyed the southern economy for a while. Now, the crippling effects of alcoholism, which is a mental disease, in my opinion, is mental. Diphtheria, some of these are no longer active, but during this time they were very much so. Diphtheria, pneumonia, tuberculosis, the disease called rickets, R-I-C-K-E-T-T-S, scarlet fever, malnutrition, and infant mortality. All of this, with the exception of infant mortality, caused the death and ill health of thousands. And with the sudden increase of mental health diseases, with no treatment agencies other than asylums, that's all they had for people with mental health problems. Just what they called insane asylums. Many were just dumped and there was no treatment other than death. With all this, the northern dream for many became nightmarish. The death of children created a deep pall, P-A-L. Poor prenatal care. And this not only affected poor black women, it affected most poor white people. This poor prenatal care, none actually, led to astronomically high infant mortality numbers and children born with irreparable physical elements and crippling birth defects, notably heart disease and rheumatic fever. As I said, some of these no longer exist, some do. They had thought up to about 10 years, no, they had thought up to about 20 years ago that they had defeated tuberculosis. There was no cases of tuberculosis active. Then all of a sudden it began to rise within the prison system. So now tuberculosis is back, and it is once again a major disease that must be confronted. Small wonder that at this time in American social history, black people began to fall victim in high numbers to mental illness. And it has gone on and on and on. There has been no interception of mental illness within the poor community. That's the title of this course. Now, it is important to point out that for many desperately poor black people who survived, they did so because they had a radical faith in God. They had the healing properties of the church, meaning that they believed in healing, divine healing, no medication, but the divine healing. And many of them had spiritual values which enabled them to survive. And they had spiritual comfort that they received from churches that sought to serve them. But this was the awesome period which witness an ascendancy of holiness, sanctified, and Pentecostal churches. All of these churches, the holiness churches, the sanctified churches, the Pentecostal churches within the poor black milieu work markedly with blacks of the Great Migration. So much so that many of these churches were referred to as, quote, migrant churches, unquote. Now, black churches worked hard. Many of them, other than the few that I mentioned earlier, but many of these churches were indispensable in binding the broken spirits of their people. As these churches were established and as they grew numerically, let's say, they were also developed as self-help movements with pastors and others working in collaboration with urban leagues and other social work agencies. And their primary interest was to keep families intact, keep them together. Secondly, to ward off crime. Thirdly, and this is something I think it would be good for churches to do today, champion nutrition. And to provide jobs for men, no matter how menial. And to such churches, black lives matter. Now, black churches, through various missions, women's auxiliaries as they were created, and Christian education departments established, Sunday schools and youth programs. Many of these churches that were Baptist initiated, and that would be the majority. That's why you see so many black people like me who remember Baptist churches, because when I was a little boy, they had to go to these churches, had to go to the schools and all these programs. Go to sleep on the hard wooden bench on Sundays. Be in church all day. Go to church at 11 o'clock. Go to church at 9 o'clock for Sunday school, 11 o'clock for service. You can go home, but you had to stay if your parents stayed because you had a 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock service. Then you couldn't go home after that. You had to stay because you had a BYPU at 6 o'clock. Then you couldn't go home because you had to stay because you had evening service at 7 o'clock. So all day long on Sundays we were in churches, trying to get some shut-eye on the bench, but food was good, but other than that, oh man. I said, Lord, you let me get out of church, and I promise I'll never come back. That's what we always say. But while Baptist churches did create these programs, they would develop into a strong, if I use the term didactic, I mean teaching, as you know the term, but it really did, it was this very strong supplement to what black children were learning in public schools. That you had the Baptist Young People's Union, it was called BYPU. It lasted until the 1950s, and it was renamed the Baptist Training Union, or the BTU, because it shifted its attention from young people to adults, and I think that was a mistake. But that's only me. It was renamed the Baptist Training Union. Then the AME and AME Zion churches were politically involved and strongly participated in the success of black Methodist colleges that were pretty abundant in those days. Now, we could call this period, if we want, somebody needs to write on this, not you all, but somebody needs to write a book or a dissertation on this period of romanticism for the black church, because I think it's very important. The period before 1920 and maybe from maybe 1910 to 1930. But this proved the church, if no other institution, to be relevant, to be resilient, and on occasion even radical. So you had three major black denominations. You had the Baptist churches, the AME, which is the African Methodist Episcopal Church, then the AMEZ, African Methodist Episcopal Zion congregations. Those three assumed the major part of leadership in at least attempting to address the difficulties fused by the Great Migration. And they did well with respect to the resources that they maybe did not have. Now, this was not the case with all of the churches, because the one institution that the people gravitated to were religious institutions. Now, because some of the churches still had high levels of anti-intellectualism. Richard Hofstadter, he's dead now. Richard Hofstadter was a German sociologist of religion. He was also a historian, and he was called at one time the father of American history. He wrote a jarring book back in the 1960s that I had in college called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. If you have a chance to read that book, please do. A lot of older writings that the colleges don't emphasize any longer, but are far more relevant than some of the writings that you get today. But now, don't trust my spelling, but I'm close. Hofstadter, Hofstadter. Very good historian. I read a lot of his books. He was on it. He died around in the late 1960s, I think, but not before producing really a whole bookshelf of books. Now, but this black intellectualism really was alive in the black clergy community, because not all black spiritual leaders recognized that social and political liberation depended upon black people themselves developing bright and unbridled leaders. And those churches that did, though, culled, C-U-L-L-E-D, culled their congregations, seeking to identify and to encourage young people into leadership mentalities. Encouraged to finish high school, these young women and men were the moral and with the moral and financial blessings of their churches, were then sent off to college, usually to Wilberforce, where my dad went in Ohio, Wilberforce University now as it's called, Lincoln, Howard, and Fisk. If you subtract Wilberforce, Lincoln, Howard, and Fisk were considered to black people like Yale and Harvard is to white people. The primary colleges or universities for black people, students. Or if they didn't go there, they went to the deeper parts of the South to black colleges in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. Georgia had both Spelman, an all-women's school, and Morehouse College, which is perhaps known more for its male intelligentsia than anything else. Reverend Martin Luther King graduated from Morehouse College. It's in Atlanta. Now, for all of the criticism and the pejorative rhetoric heaped on the black church and its weak and inept leadership,
MI team, call emergency department, critical care bay. MI team, call emergency department, critical care bay.
now these same churches that were made fun of, let's put it that way, worked to bravely feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the sick, comfort the dying, when there were few others willing to do so. And Many of the urban black churches which reached prestigious levels and acclaim in the 40s, 50s, and 60s were, quote, migrant churches. Many of the black churches that you see in any community started off in houses, very weak situations, founded by the people who were coming up. Migrants, immigration people. Many if not the majority, we should say, started during this period under mean and lowly conditions and supported and maintained by poor and very lowly educated black people. And most all of these religious institutions were led by unlettered men and women, but men and women of uncommon merit, spiritual power and vision. And they had instincts. Their organizational skills and practical leadership during times of duress for African Americans was nothing short of heroic. And it is to those women and men who must receive the praise for the vitality and resilience of the black church in America. The black church in America started off like a seed and then had to grow out. I used to teach at, I taught at two seminaries, Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, Pennsylvania, and also at Colgate Rochester here, school that I graduated from with my master's degree. And I used to tell young people in my classes who were zeroing in on pastoral careers, I said, don't you ever forget that if you're called to a good church, meaning that's going to support you and your family financially, that is well established in community, don't you ever forget how those churches started. You're standing on the shoulders of women and men who couldn't read, who couldn't write, but they had vision. And now you are assuming, you will be, the benefits of what they suffered to get this whole thing started. I told them that if they are planted in a solid church and they get a request to preach at a storefront, I tell them, don't you dare say no, because that's where it all started. You say yes, and you go and you do your best, because you don't know the inspiration you give this poor little preacher who's down in a little storefront church, already thinking that he or she is rejected. You go, you do what you can do, because it's very important that this happens. But in addition, though, to the several black religious institutions which sought to assist the refugees of the migration, were several predominantly Episcopal and Catholic parishes which had high levels of black membership. They had white spiritual leaders. The priests of both the Episcopal churches and the Catholic churches were white during this period, but nonetheless the numbers were there. But these churches were not immune to finding a few of their own among the human rubble of downtrodden poor families from the South. But even with religious and social agency support, many black people did not make this transition. Very difficult transition. This would represent those who were not able to control the conditions of their lives. And when you all go out into the field to do your work professionally, you're going to run into people who cannot control their lives. That's why you're working with them in the first place. They cannot control their lives. They lack the self-determination to control their lives. That's why they are in poverty. That's why they have no power. That's why they have no determination. That's why they have nothing. They cannot control their lives. If you cannot control your lives, you're not free. You belong to other people. So remember that now. Empowerment means freedom. Without empowerment, there is none. Now, if you want to write your papers in other classes, you want to put that in there, give me credit. And I'll duke it out with your professor. I said, come on. Now, for many others, however, the Great Migration proved to be a rewarding and very beneficial experience. Now, my two families didn't have any difficulty. They came to a less competitive area, Ohio. But I grew up as a child with all kind of security, and with my two sisters, we didn't have much of any of this, but all of this was happening everywhere. Not that we were better, but the fact is that my father was a college graduate, and my dad was the only college graduate on the whole neighborhood that we lived in. My father was the only one. And had it not been for World War II, he would have been a doctor. But this would be those who were able to find permanent employment, were able to sustain their families, were able to avoid lingering or serious poverty. They were able to send their children to school and live in more comfortable and sanitary housing. Some even became homeowners, while others in time would be able to send a few of their children to college. Mutually, most all would claim some kind of church membership. Now, there were other social advantages as well. Blacks who had the determination oftentimes followed the spirit of entrepreneurship and went into business for themselves with financial assistance generally from an organization started by Booker T. Washington, known as the Negro Business League, which today we call it seed money, but would give organizational money to an entrepreneur to get them started. While still others who found themselves favorably involved in electoral politics for the first time in their lives. Life in the North, to this group of people from the Great Migration, permitted them to exercise their right to vote, the majority for the very first time. Now, whatever the effects of the Great Migration, it placed in motion the social movement that over the course of 60 years would witness many of these northern cities becoming predominantly black in percentages of population. Those northern cities that I named, at least half of that number have black people by percentage in the majority. That's where it started from, the Great Migration. And the majority of those people are really less than what we would call able to sustain themselves very strongly. Any questions at this point? All right.
Actually, I have a question.
Yeah.
Like, why do you think that some of those cities are more like, I guess, just like doing better than others in terms of like, you know, metrics like, you know, public schools or like social, because like I'm thinking of like Camden, which is probably like, it has the highest rate of violent crime in New Jersey, you know, it has the worst schools, has the highest levels of poverty, and then I'm thinking of like, and I think the population of Camden, I think it's majority, I African American. Right?
Yes.
But then I'm thinking of like, Newark is kind of in a similar situation. It has a lot of, crime and terrible public schools. Jersey City's doing a little bit better, I think. They have some good public high schools.
I don't know. I don't think any better.
Mm.
The majority of black children attending public schools today ancestrally have come from the southern migrant stream that worked the apple orchards, the onion fields, and other vegetative plantations around in Monroe County. And once their parents moved into the city, because the children were always being sent back to the South for school until the 1950s. And then they started moving into the city and renting property, because many of the persons, mostly men, were finding employment at Kodak and at Xerox, and was called the Heloid, H-E-L-O-I-D, the Heloid. They made cameras industry, and other places like Bausch and Lomb, some of the larger industries. The railroad is very active in the 30s and 40s and 50s in this area. But the children were going to the schools, and the children were ill-equipped because they were not strongly educated prior to coming into the city. And this has just grown, it's grown, it's grown. And now the majority, in terms of percentage of the children in the public schools in Rochester, and I think this can be duplicated in most cities, are African American. And as a result of that, the intellectual level has decreased, and the poverty level has increased, and parents do not really support the schools, and the schools have been shown to be academic failures throughout this country. So when a person like Mrs. Betsy Devine is asked to become the superintendent of education, her first priority is the elimination of public schools and the creation of charter schools in all areas, the voucher system, and to create private schools. And what this is going to do, she's not going to be successful, but what this argues for is the really rapid disintegration of the public school system as we have known it, and which means that the largest number of children not going to school who will not qualify for the other schools are going to be poor black and Latino children. Some poor white children won't even be able to make it, simply because public school is their only chance that they have for escalation. Pardon me, escalation. We still have in this country children who graduated from high school who represent the first person in their total family ever to graduate from high school. But the thing is, we have to save public schools, because public schools are very, very important. Even today, the highest number of successful people in the world are graduates of public schools, not private schools. So there was a time when public education was very good. It was quality education. But that has really, well, I was a member of a public school when it was still, I think, very, very functional, simply because of what we were expected to attain to as students. I don't think that's there now. I think we do have mercenaries who are teaching. We don't have committed people. People are backing away from situations because they say they're afraid, this, that, and the other. But one of the things that has led to the decomposition of public education, if you permit me to say this, the fact that a lot of the children who attend schools have no discipline. They're from families that have not really emphasized discipline, and they're from families where the educational level itself is very low, which means that the commitment of these families to public education, other than shoving a child out the door and leaving all of the problems up to teachers who are not social workers, who are not psychologists, who are not psychiatrists. They've been trained to do only one thing, is teach. And that's what they're supposed to do. They're not supposed to do all these other things. But they have to, because the children are suffering. But what relates to many of these children, what happens is that they fall through what they call the cracks, and by third, fourth grade, they're in special education, and they never graduate. If they graduate, they got something that they cannot use in terms of furthering their education in unless you have a school like Monroe Community College that will create programs specifically for these children, these young people, to deal with their language difficulties and their math difficulties, which would give them entree into first and second year of college at a junior college. But you know, that's even rare, because my years of teaching at Monroe Community College, I taught there for 28 years. I saw so many young people just come in the door and go out the door. It's like a little revolving door they used to make. I'd say, you go in one side, if you can't, don't sit up, you just go right around, go right back out on the street where you are. So that's how that works. And it's, we got to get people in there that can fix that situation, which I think is very fixable. Human beings can do anything. Horace Callan, who for many, many years taught at Cornell University, he was a humanist, but he wrote a book once called The Liberal Spirit, and it talked about the ability of just people who are committed to make changes, can make changes in the world. If they don't give up, they can make changes. Yes?
I feel like it's not a discipline thing, but more of like, I guess, so our grandparents' generation, like 2 generations before us, they kind of needed school to get them out of the struggle that they were in. And so they put an emphasis on their children or our parents to get an education. But because of the economy, when our parents were growing up, we didn't need an education to make a living. So now I feel like our generation is like, well, my parents did it without school, so that means I don't need school. But now the economy is switching again, so now we need an education in order to make a living. And so I think that there's this huge like turnover rate because of the values that we see our parents live by. Like I know my parents did not need an education and they made a fine living, you know, but like my grandparents could not have raised my parents without having an education and like a good job. So I don't know if it's that people are less disciplined, but rather they don't see the importance of it.
I think it's generational. I think that older generations did see the importance of education. Some of the European immigrants demanded that their children learn to speak English simply because it was really the stepping stone to education. And even through the Great Migration, you had people really, for example, when I was growing up, people demanded you stay in school, that you learn, that you get an education. Education was really considered by all classes prior to 40 years ago as the way up, the step up. I still argue that point. Many people still argue that point, but the fact is that it is a generational thing, like you said. And we still have people, though, with the self-determination and the get-up-and-go quality in their lives, that they, even though they might represent the first person ever to graduate from college and their family, they are intercepting a cycle. You understand? Once you intercept a cycle and you start it in another direction, you're in good shape. A cycle meaning that if you're in a poverty cycle, this goes round and round, there's nothing that happens within the context of life that changes that cycle, then it's going to be repeated. But if there's just one interruption of that cycle, there stands to be a wider opportunity for others to take advantage of it, even if it means the offspring of the person who did do it. Because I don't know of a college graduate anywhere hasn't demanded that their child go to school. They recognize that. And so that's how you interrupt cycle. That's hard to do, maybe. You know, but remember, there's an old European statement that what is past is prologue, that you cannot change the future because everything is going to repeat itself. I really don't believe that. I believe more in Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the German philosopher, who indicated there are 3 things that we must deal with. There is a thesis, there is a hypothesis, something that argues, then there is a synthesis, bringing all 3 of those together for a benefit. If that doesn't occur, if you have a hypothesis and you have an antithesis, then nothing is going to be accomplished. If you have a synthesis, sounds like compromise, I don't know if that's what it means or not, but at least you have something that you can place your foot on that's going to change a cycle. And that's what Hegel was arguing in his German philosophy, and I think he was correct, nearly 200 years ago. But it's up to you all. I and every professor can yell at you and scream at you and tell you what you should do, but still, it's just like children. After they turn 18, can't tell them anything. They're on their own. They're adults according to the law. Can't do anything to them. But while they're under the roof, I told you before, 17 years old, 17 years, 17 years and 11 and a half months, they're mine. And they better do as I say. After they turn 18, they can do what they want to do, but it's been planted here and here. All y'all are probably glad to get away from home, but you're going to come back here, and it never leaves here, because you are who you are. Remember that. Don't let anybody change you. You are who you are. Dr. Thornton, you are who you are. Everybody, you're who you are. Miss Ruiz, you're who you are. Senorita. All right? Miss Weaver, you're who you are. Everybody, you're who you are. You too. Who you are. Can't change. That's it. All right. Now, let's move ahead. Oh! Here we come, Mom. In addition to the black Great Migration would be black people from the Caribbean. Let's look at this just for a minute. They would make an impactful presence. Now, from 1900 to 1930, that's 30 years, approximately 100,000 Afro-Caribbeans migrated to America from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Barbados, Trinidad, St. Thomas, St. Martin's, Grenada, and other Caribbean lands, with the largest number coming from British colonial Jamaica, with lesser numbers from St. Kitts, British Guiana, and Bermuda. My son-in-law, he is a British, his ancestry, British Guiana. Am I saying that correctly? Guyana? It's no longer under British colonialism, but at this time it was. But that's where his family is from. Now, the Great Migration dramatically increased the black West Indian population in New York City. Now listen to these figures. In 1900, there were only 3,552 Caribbean blacks in the city, including Brooklyn. By 1910, that number had risen to 12,851. By 1910, 10 years later, 12,851. By 1920, at the end of the Great Migration, the number stood at 36,613. 36,613. And by 1930 also had reached 60,000. 60,000. Thus, between 1890 and 1930, New York City's black population overall, due to the Caribbean influence had grown by 51%. The black population in both Philadelphia and Chicago would grow by 30% between 1900 and 1910, by 30%. Woo. That's because of employment, and also because of the Defender newspaper that we talked about last week. But by 1930, by 59% in Philadelphia, 109% in Detroit, thanks to the automobile industry, 114% in Chicago, and in its stream had led to a massive growth in urban black churches throughout much of the North. Now, due to Haiti being under occupational oppression by the United States Marines between 1915 to 1934, it would have no statistical impact on Caribbean immigration during the Great Migration because it was under United States control. It severely restricted immigration of Haitians into the United States. Now there would be a mutual bonding between most black West Indian groups and black people, meaning African American. Black people from the South would not be the only people of color affected by the social conditions that would cause them to be lured to the American North. Thus, there would be thousands of black and other non-whites from the Caribbean who also would migrate to the United States during the Great Migration, increasing both the numbers as well as the tensions. Afro-Caribbeans found themselves not only suffering the same neighborhoods as the southern refugees of the Great Migration, but suffering the same blatant northern racism, including police brutality and exploitation by unethical white merchants. Afro-Caribbeans and African Americans found themselves in collaboration with each other almost from the beginning, in identifying their discomfort as being the result of the common color of their skin. And despite the historical misinformation to the contrary, there was much cooperation between them. Although to some from the Caribbean, outright and severe racial oppression was to be pretty much a new experience. And while the Harlem Renaissance has been recorded by social historians as an African American achievement, the artistic and intellectual contributions of Afro-Caribbeans was brilliant and enduring. So despite the numbers, the impact was favorable. Now, in terms of religion, so I want you to have this history because it's important. The Episcopal churches serving black communities was buoyed or strengthened in their numbers at this time because the Christian experiences of the majority of Caribbeans was in the Anglican faith. And those who were to extend that spiritual relationship in Northern American cities found the Episcopal churches prepared to serve them because there were no more Anglican churches because of the Revolutionary War, and the Episcopal Church was the American model of the Anglican Church. Now, I consulted several studies on the impact of Afro-Caribbeans during this period, and I think they're very good. There's a very meaningful 1987 article that I read that's called The Causes and Composition of the West Indian Immigration to New York City, 1900 to 1952. Covers much longer, wider period of time than I did for migration, but good information. And that's found in a periodical that's published by Buffalo State University, Afro-Americans in New York Life and History. Afro-Americans in New York Life and History. And this is in volume 2, number 1. And the writer is Calvin Holder, H-O-L-D. Now, one of the heaviest and primary sources on Afro-Caribbeans and the Great Migration is a rare, very rare published master's thesis. You really have to dig to find this one. It's written by a man named Barrington Dunbar. Has a very long title because it was originally a master's thesis at Columbia University, but again, strong enough to be republished as a book. Barrington Dunbar is the writer. Now, if you're ready for this long, long title, this is it. Factors in the cultural background of the of the American Southern Negro. Factors in the cultural background of the American Southern Negro and the British West Indian Negro, common name, title for that period, that conditions their adjustment in Harlem. Factors in the cultural background of the American Southern Negro and the British West Indian Negro that conditions their adjustment in Harlem. Now get this, this was written way, way back, long before your parents were even born, 1935. 1935, but it's one of the best things ever written on. What? All right, when we get back, we're going to talk about, well, not this, now this Wednesday, we're going to take a brief break from this, so we'll have one more lecture on it. We're going to talk about other religious and other white, we're going to talk about white Christian and Jewish agencies that were very affirmative in assisting black people during the Great Migration, as well as a few other things. But this Wednesday coming, and please be here, April 12th, we'll talk about paper expectations for this course. Paper expectations for this course. Now, some of you came in just a wee bit late. I said that, you know, some of you probably have already started on your papers, and that is fine, so long as you're within that perimeter of what we want. And we will not have any papers on the Great Migration or the European immigration. Don't have enough time. There's no need of doing that. So the only writing that you'll have from this moment on, who wrote that? Who wrote from this moment on? Either Irving Berlin or Cole Porter. From this moment on. Oh, well, I know I have a wonderful, I don't have to do this. I can sing, I can make CDs and everything. Shoot. But at any rate, that's what we'll do on Wednesday. All minds clear?
Yes.
All right. Very good. And we'll continue. Oh, did everybody sign? All right. Sister Harper, you sign it. Anybody else down that way? Dr. Taylor. Dr. Taylor. Now, 10 years from now, you're going to be in some city, you're going to see a sign that says Dr. Taylor Thornton, 3rd floor, Suite D. You all go up and have your temperature taken. All right. Miss Rose, I'll see you in here. Thank you, everybody. You can slide down here. Age before beauty. Have a seat. Have a seat. You're welcome. Thank you.